Imagine standing on a battlefield in the year 1400. You are safe behind a massive stone wall that has stood for 200 years. You feel invincible. But then, fast forward just 100 years. That same wall is shattering like glass. The ground shakes, the air smells like rotten eggs, and a thunderous roar drowns out the screams of soldiers. What changed? What changed? A black powder and a metal tube turned the entire rule book of war upside down. For thousands of years, the sword and the bow were the masters of the field. But in a blink of history, they were pushed aside by a terrifying new god of war. This is the story of how clumsy, heavy metal pipes evolved into the ultimate weapon that decided the fate of empires. We have to start our journey in the early 1500s. Back then, cannons were already around, but honestly, they were a bit of a nightmare to use. Imagine trying to drag a solid metal tube that weighs as much as a school bus through thick mud. That is what generals had to deal with. In the early days, these great guns were mostly used for one thing: smashing castles. If a king wanted to take over a city, he would park these giant bombards outside the walls and fire massive stone balls day after day. It was slow, and it was expensive. But on the open battlefield, where soldiers were running around, these cannons were almost useless. Why? Because once you put a cannon in place, it stayed there. If the enemy moved to the left or right, you couldn't just swivel the gun around. You were stuck. Plus, they were incredibly dangerous. It wasn't rare for a cannon to explode and kill the very people firing it. So, at the start of our timeline, artillery was strong, but it was slow, stupid, and stubborn. It was definitely not the king yet. It was more like a grumpy giant that slept half the time. Now, let's move into the late 1500s and early 1600s. This is where things get interesting. Engineers and mathematicians started getting involved. They realized that bigger wasn't always better. They stopped using stone balls and switched to iron. Iron was heavier and hit harder, which meant you could make the cannonballs smaller but keep the same destructive power. Smaller bowls meant smaller gun barrels, and smaller barrels meant the guns were lighter. Suddenly, you could put cannons on wheels that horses could actually pull. This was a game changer. We have to talk about a Swedish king named Gustavus Adolphus. You might not hear his name at dinner parties, but in the world of history, he's a superstar. He looked at those heavy, immovable guns and said, "We can do better." He created light field guns. Some were so light that 2 men and a horse could drag them anywhere. For the first time, artillery could move with the army. If the infantry charged forward, the cannons went with them. If they had to retreat, the cannons saved them. Gustavus didn't just use guns to scare people. He used them to blast holes in the enemy lines so his soldiers could rush in. This was the moment artillery stopped being a siege tool and started becoming a battlefield weapon. By the time we reached the 1700s, artillery wasn't just an art, it was a science. This is the era of standardized parts. Think about it like this. Before the 1700s, if a wheel broke on a cannon, you had to find the specific blacksmith who made that specific wheel. Nothing fit. It was a logistical nightmare. But then, French engineers came up with a brilliant system. They standardized everything. A whale for an 8-pounder gun would fit any 8-pounder gun in the entire army. This seems like a small detail, but it won wars. It meant armies could move faster and fix their gear on the fly. They also improved the ammunition. It wasn't just solid round balls anymore. They developed something called canister shot, or grape shot. Imagine a tin can filled with musket balls or scrap metal. When the cannon fired, the can would rip open, turning the cannon into a giant shotgun. If a group of enemy soldiers was charging at you, one shot of canister could wipe out dozens of men in a split second. It was terrifying. It changed the way soldiers marched. You couldn't just bunch up in a tight group anymore because one cannon shot would end it all. The mere sound of artillery being wheeled into position was enough to make brave men tremble. As we approach the late 1700s and the year 1800, we meet the man who would crown artillery as the true king of battle, Napoleon Bonaparte. Before he was an emperor, Napoleon was an artillery officer. He understood the math and the power of these guns better than anyone. He didn't just spread his guns out along the line like everyone else. No, he did something different. He massed them together. He would take huge numbers of guns, sometimes 50 or 100, and point them all at one specific spot in the enemy line. He called it a grand battery. It was like a hammer blow. He would pound that one spot until it disintegrated, and then he would send in his troops to finish the job. This era was the turning point. To truly understand how this power peaked, you have to look at what historians often describe as Napoleonic artillery tactics, where guns weren't just support, they were the main event. By using speed, mass, and precision, artillery became the deciding factor in who lived and who died. It was no longer just about who had the most brave soldiers. It was about who had the best guns and knew how to use them. So, why do we call it the King of Battle? Between 1500 and 1800, war changed from a personal fight to an industrial machine. In 1500, if you wanted to win, you needed strong men with armor. By 1800, you needed factories, mathematicians, and iron. Artillery forced armies to dig trenches. It forced castles to change their shape into low, star-shaped forts. It forced soldiers to spread out. It dictated every single movement on the field. The general who controlled the artillery controlled the battle. It was a long journey from those clumsy, exploding tubes in the mud to the lightning-fast horse artillery of the 19th century. But in those 300 years, gunpowder conquered the world. The roar of the cannons eventually shaped the borders of the modern world we live in today. If you enjoyed this journey through the smoke and fire of the past, please make sure to hit that like button. Really helps the video reach more history lovers like you. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story from the past. This is HistoryHearth, signing off.